Okay, this is week 8 in a 16-week course. So you know what that means, right? Yeah, it's time for the midterm exam. Okay, you guys know how this works. This is the first 6 chapters of the book. I have a set of videos here that you're watching now that basically go through a list of topics. I'm providing you a list of topics that are going to appear on the exam. This is not the questions, this is just the topics. The idea is, instead of having you study this much material, I'm telling you, here's what's going to be on the exam. So it just helps you out. Okay. You guys remember, though, that I use my lecture notes when I'm building these quizzes, so it'd be a very good idea for you guys to look at lecture notes as well. Right? Okay, just saying. Okay, so let's click on the list and let's get started. So here are the rules. The midterm does cover the first 6 chapters of the book. It is open book, open internet, open everything. I mean, you're doing this from home, so it's no big deal. I'm not, constraining you in any way. There's going to be 40 questions in a pool, but you're not going to get 40 on the exam. So essentially, the machine's going to go and pull 25 questions out of this pool of 40, so you'll get 25. Now, the thing is, I don't know which 25 you're going to get, and I don't know what order they're going to get in. So that's a little confusing because you may get like a chapter 2 question followed by a chapter 7 question followed by a chapter 1 question. I mean, the order is completely weird. So to kind of help you focus, because sometimes the context of the question may be a little difficult to discern, inside the exam I give you the chapter and page numbers. Now, this is a timed exam, so it's not like you can say, oh, let's see, chapter 2, page 56, let me go find that in the book. No, you really don't have enough time to do all that. You really kind of sort of need to have all this stuff already in your head, so you can just snap those guys off. Now, you guys have taken my exams before, you know how this works. It could be that a strategy for you would be like do all the true false and multiple choice, those things, get those out of the way and then come back and do the short answers if you're running out of time. I'm just giving you some suggestions. Okay, let's continue. So the page and the chapter and the page numbers are really to help you study. This is to help you go find that section in the book and read. Now, if I said, for example, something is not in the book, well then how in the world can I give you a page number for something that I already told you ain't there? So in that case, like, for example, I don't know, units of measure. On page 111, they talk about something that's kind of sort of related. So it's a placeholder to give you context, but clearly if you go to page 11, you're not going to find the answer there. Okay, so that's what the no column means. As usual, I've mentioned this to you before, that about 20% or so of the material that it shows up on these quizzes and exams are coming from lecture. So if you're not paying attention to the lecture and you're not taking notes, you're probably not going to make that good a score on this thing. Okay, it's timed. You got an hour and 15 minutes to do these things. So let's just go through the list. And so I'm just going to talk about them to kind of, again, give you some context. And I'll point out something. I may zero in on a particular question and say, make sure you read this. So take notes during this video, okay? Because if you run across one of those and that I said, hey, pay particular attention to the wording because this might be confusing, and then if you get that question and you don't do that, well, hey, what the heck? Hey, I'm trying to make this thing easy for you. I'm trying to actually help you here. So let's continue. All right. So I'm just going to go through the list and talk. So the first one talks about, remember the thing about the difference between data and information and how the one gets transformed into the other. I even gave a cooking analogy talking about chocolate chip cookies and stuff. If you remember all that, you're in good shape. The next one talks about feedback, and we talked about how you have input and processing and output. In the book, they had a cool little picture of a car wash. And the feedback arrows coming off, that kind of stuff. You kind of remember some of that? I think you'd be in good shape. The next one just talks about, the difference between the web and the internet, which came first. One is a subset of the other, that kind of stuff. Again, I think that's pretty simple. Next it talks about e-commerce types. You remember the business to business and business to consumer and consumer to consumer? All those little 3-letter acronyms. Again, most people wouldn't have too much trouble with that, I don't think. Next it talks about the information pyramid. Remember how like at the very top of the pyramid is all these really cool custom-made decision support systems. And then at the very bottom of the pyramid is the dull, boring, mostly data-centric kind of things, like the transaction processing system where all the data gets entered, and then it gets, data, and it gets a little bit more valuable and more valuable as it goes up the pyramid. Okay, that kind of stuff. The next one talks about transaction processing. The TPS, transaction processing system. What's it all about? Where is it in the information pyramid? Those kind of questions. Value chain from chapter 2. I may give you a scenario, say, give me an example of a value chain in this particular manufacturing or something like that, where you're going to have to describe what value chain is. And when you give me these short answers, I leave you guys notes. When you give me these short answers, give me enough information so I can tell that you know what the heck you're talking about. So don't just say, bubble gum. And I'm going, okay, that might be a good example, but I don't have enough information to tell if you know what you're talking about. It could have been a lucky guess. So give me a sentence or two that explains it all. The next one talks about organizational structures. Remember we talked about, all the traditional hierarchy kind of a thing, and we even did a paper on some of this stuff about flattening the organization and hybrids and virtuals and all the rest of these things. Yeah, remember a bit about the organizational structures, you'd be okay. Cloud computing. I've mentioned cloud computing over and over and over in multiple chapters, and I always stressed one particular component. Yep, that'd be good to know. The 5-force model, remember that in the chapter? They talked about how, there's, the threats of new entrants and things of that nature, and competition among suppliers and, the bargaining power of buyers, those kind of things. So I'm going to give you some examples of how that helps competitive advantage. Or one of those things of, which of the following are true of one of those particular types. Strategic planning for competitive analysis. Competitive, competitive advantage. There, I lost the A. Anyway, the idea is that, now I'll admit, this is probably one of the ones, if I was taking this exam, that would probably be one of the ones I would have to damn near memorize. Or at least put a footnote out, because I don't have that stuff in my head. I don't necessarily have the 5-force model and the strategic planning stuff in my head, and I'm not gonna memorize it because I can just go look it up. So I think you're okay. The next one talks about the 3 phases of automation. I talked about this from a historical perspective. In the beginning, automation was primarily doing this, and then after that was done, the next phase of automating projects was doing something else, and then the third phase was doing something else. If you remember all that, you're good to go. CPU speed. Remember we talked about how when you're trying to determine whether a processor is better than another one for a particular task, there's lots of different things you can look at, and one of which is the speed of the CPU, typically in gigahertz. Units of measure. This is one of the ones where we talked about when you're talking about storage. If I have a stick of RAM, or if I have a hard drive, what unit of measure is the most appropriate for those things. The next one is just talks about multiprocessing, because a lot of computers have multiple cores and they can do multiprocessing. And so just a question on, how prevalent is that, and, are there scenarios where that particularly isn't helpful. Secondary storage. Remember, primary storage is RAM, and secondary storage is stuff that sticks around after the power goes out. Okay, cool. NAS versus SAN. Yeah, this is another one of those common threads that run through the course, talking about, why is one better than another given a particular scenario? Yep, that'd be good to know. Source data automation. Remember the whole technique of, if I'm making the person who's responsible for entering the data, finding and fixing the errors at the same time, then I have all sorts of benefits. If you know what those benefits are, you'll be able to answer the question. The next one talks about computer system types. We're talking about, desktop and nettop and, thin client and, notebooks and netbooks and all the rest of that stuff. So that's what I mean by computer system types. The next one is chapter 4 talking about the software stuff. The documentation types. I talked about how documentation really ought to be tailored to a particular user or category of users and not just have one giant documentation that handles everything. That's never a good idea. So if you remember that discussion, you're good to go. The next one talks about the spheres of influence. That makes it sound really cool. Basically what they're talking about is, does it cover like the personal workspace sphere? Does it kind of handle the networked shared kind of community, and does it handle, big mainframe supercomputer kinds of things? So the spheres of influence is just from single user, multi-user, and big server thing. So a little bit about that, I think you'll be in good shape. The next one talks about just some rules that I mentioned in lecture about the operating system, what it does and doesn't do, that kind of stuff. Hardware abstraction, that's not exactly the term that they use, but it's an industry term that's very common to talk about the hardware abstraction layer, a technique that manufacturers use so that what? If you can finish that sentence, then you're in good shape. The next one talks about processing tasks. And there was an entire discussion there on chapter 4 talking about how, you have multi-processing and multi-this and multi-that, a bunch of different types of processing. And this is probably one that I wouldn't commit to memory either. I'm going to ask you about one particular type and say, given this example, which one of these multis are we talking about? Acquiring software. Typically there's two major techniques. You can either go commercial off the shelf, where you just go to the store and buy the dang thing. Or you can commission your own staff or perhaps a third party to build you some software. And so I'm going to be talking about the pros and cons of acquiring software. Somewhat similar to one of your writing assignments. All right, the next one talks about software types. And we talked about application software and system software, that kind of stuff. That's a good one. I think everyone can handle that one. I put an asterisk here on this section because the two different software types are scattered all over that chapter. So, I had to pick a number, so I just picked that one, put an asterisk next to it, basically meaning, well, that's the beginning of the discussion of one of the types. You probably have to go find the other one. Okay, chapter 5 is all about databases, if you remember, and one of the discussions is the importance of this primary key. What's it do for a living would be an excellent question. Data modeling. Why is data modeling important? A lot of people don't like to do any type of modeling. They don't like to do, flow charts or any of those kind of things, or any type of modeling before they start to do the work. Why, in the database world, is this very, very important? Okay, this is probably a good place to stop for the 15-minute mark. We'll finish this thing up in just a few minutes.